Good morning, Propenomix people, and hello, Property and Propenomix people as well. Thanks for joining another supplement video here. And this week's, I'm afraid I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit and talk about how to solve the UK's fiscal black hole at the moment, with the budget looming upon us, of course, only about 6 weeks away as I'm recording this. And have a little chat with Rachel about how she should be sorting it out, rather than putting taxes up, rather than cutting welfare necessarily. There's definitely another way to do it. I've talked about it a little bit before, but I'm going to go into a bit more detail today. So, if you've listened before, you'll know I like to start with a quote. And this week's was, "The Bank of England's decisions having such large fiscal implications at a time when the Chancellor wants to be fiscally tight is clearly not helpful. Furthermore, the losses the central bank makes are gains for the private sector, funneling billions of public money into commercial banks and the financial sector." That was from Dominic Caddick, who is an NEF, New Economics Forum economist. And that is about the deep dive, but I'm going to go straight into that quantitative tightening mess that is ongoing when we get there. Now, as the calendar creeps towards a new year, it's a natural time to pause and tackle the biggest challenges that keep small to medium enterprises, property businesses, from achieving true sustainable growth. For most, this boils down to two core areas: laying a bulletproof strategic plan for the next 12 months, and finally cracking the code on financial measurement and accountability. If you've ever felt lost in a sea of bookkeeping data, or if your productivity methods are falling short, it's time to switch from doing to leading and truly understand how your assets are performing. Book in on our next property business workshop with myself and Rod Turner on Thursday, the 22nd of January in central London. The link's in the show notes. It's also at bit.ly/PBW and then a number 9. Okay, Donald. It could have been such a momentous week personally if the gong had gone his way, but the Nobel Peace Prize will have to wait at least one more year. Frankly, on a personal level, I'd be stunned if he doesn't win it at some point, but sometimes it's 20, 30 years down the track. That is just how Nobel works. Not for Donald, not what he wanted, of course, but that's where it is. But as usual, you can hardly accuse him of puffery, having put an end to 3,000 years worth of tension this week, as was his claim. I mean, in seriousness, the one word you can't countenance about the man, I do feel, is warmonger. I heard it slung around a few times this week, but evidently it simply isn't true. I don't think I need to spend any time debunking that one. But having played a significant part in getting the Gaza situation to ceasefire, and in the early stages of the 20 or 21 point plan that's been laid out, Trump's version of events is that after the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, was awarded the Nobel, they spoke on the phone and she told him that he should have won it. I would keep your eyes open for next year. As I've said, the betting markets had a separate favourite, which was a Sudanese organisation, right up until the end, and the betting markets gave Trump about a 20 to 25% chance. So it perhaps wasn't the shock that the White House made it out to be. All part of the veneer, though, of course. Still, the headlines were stolen again late on Friday as we reverted back to the word of 2025, the tariff. A beautiful word, we were told, the most beautiful. But not to the day traders who held long positions on Friday. An absolute bloodbath ensued in the stock markets and in the crypto markets as it goes, after a relative essay on Truth Social was published by the press regarding China's material dominance and overall behaviour towards, well, everywhere else. A letter had upset Mr. Trump and others. Essentially, it comes down to China seeking strategic control of their supply chain and protecting their semiconductor manufacturing industry by whatever means necessary, it seems. That seems to be the next arms race that's well underway, AI and computing power. I saw a stat this week, and I didn't have time to establish the veracity of it, I should add. Without AI-related growth, US GDP growth this year so far would be 0.1%. But it's not the US who are the only ones making noise here. This is not smoke and no fire. The EU, South Korea, Japan have all already spoken on this matter, and they're not happy for a variety of reasons. Once again, as in the pandemic, when the revelation that 90% of US pharmaceuticals were made in China at the time that hit the headlines, the dependency on the Chinese supply chain is shown to have geopolitical weaknesses at the top level, and the drive for lowest cost has hidden costs downstream. The economist in me therefore looks at all of this and thinks one word: inflation. What did the Trump essay mean? Well, a market bloodbath, Nvidia leading the charge, cutting over $200 billion from its valuation. The overall market haircut was over $1 trillion. Welcome to 2025, when one tweet cost the world's wealthy $1 trillion. Aside from those who might have traded before the tweet went out, of course. Oh, did I say that out loud? Mr. Trump highlighted that this was a strange day for China to choose, given the Middle East situation. And those of us who've been around long enough would be inclined to agree. Never believe in coincidences. Meanwhile, after these two momentous events, the US government shutdown continues. 4,000 plus layoffs have been suggested across government departments in the interim. Trump's approval rating amongst low-income voters is down from 40% to 35%, according to recent polling, which also shows that more disapprove of his handling of the economy and the shutdown than approve of it. Perhaps he's been a little distracted elsewhere, some might say. Higher income groups have got a higher opinion of him, however, than they did before. Many pointed to the continued deployment of the National Guard. This week was Chicago, as an action not congruent with a Nobel winner. And then New York Attorney General Letitia James was also in the lawfare crosshairs herself. She got stuck into Trump in 2023, so her time came to defend a rental property that was on a resi mortgage, as I understand it. The case, she paid a lower interest rate than she otherwise would have done. The penalty, up to 30 years in jail and up to $1 million in fines. The reality of the situation, it just looks like a bit of tit for tat. My thoughts at the time were simple. If you come for the king, you better not miss. You can't suggest for a second that it won't make some others think twice before tangling with the orange man. What is the continuing narrative? High octane, high pace, high risk stuff from the Donald. I'm stunned investors are not more nervous, and also stunned there hasn't been more fallout from some of these plays as yet. The realistic short-term impact is that US growth is a few clicks lower than it otherwise would have been, which is always hard to prove because what's happened has happened and the rest is modelling. But the tariff situation has cost households and sent more money to the US coffers. And I've seen figures like $1,300 a household this year so far and things like that. The other word that's been brought back to life this week has been TACO, which stands for Trump always chickens out. So they see this as a TACO trade. He says something really tough. It opens negotiations. Everything drops like it did on Friday. Then buy the dip because ultimately we'll get to the end and it won't happen. And already since that tweet on Friday, we have seen Mr. Trump's language softening again towards China. So whether he was warned that was too far of a shot across the bow or whether it was all just part of his tactics all along, who knows, right? And look, filling the US coffers with tariff money or whatever money, they need it. In reality, a balance between the growth and the deficit. And it's about protectionism and a shift away from globalization, which many would say is vindicated by the Chinese approach to the modern world. Whew. Transatlantic, back to the safety of the real-time UK property market. Chris Watkin dunks another one with week 39 in the can. Listings printing 34.3k, down 1,000 on last week as the market quiets after the typical September glut. My 10% more stock than the normal market ready reckoner continues to work on the back of about 2 years of overperformance of listings compared to historical averages. There have been 1.41 million homes listed this year so far, and we're 10.4% ahead of the 9-year average. But that does include 2020, which I always think pollutes the figures a little bit. And we're inching back towards the 2024 listing numbers now. We were 6 and 7% ahead of them at certain points in the year, but we're now only 2.4% ahead. But we're still 10% ahead of what was being listed before the pandemic. So, how many price reductions in week 39? 25,600. September, we saw 14.1% of stock reduced. So August was 11.1, but it looked like an anomaly, ultimately. We've seen about 13.1 this year in total, on average, I should say. And the 5-year average is only 10.7. So there's a lot more reductions going on. 22% more reductions, and the fact there's more stock. If you add that 22% on, and then you add on all the extra listings we've got as well, which is at least 10 or 15%, there's more like it's well in the 30s, if not 40% more reduced stock than there would normally be on a market. We still had over 100,000 price reductions in the past month. If you can't find a deal, you just got to keep the legwork up and you'll get there. You don't see 13% plus of stock being reduced in strong markets by any stretch. Then 25,600 sold subject to contract, exactly the same number as the price reductions as it goes. And the average for the year, 26,100. But week 39s on average print 25,700 over the years. So very, very smack on average for sold subjects. But like I say, more stock there, same amount of demand roughly as average has been for the past 9 years. Sold subjects are at 5.3 on 2024 though, and they're at 13.3 on the pre-pandemic market. Still nearly keeping pace with 2022. And now we've passed the day of the lettuce, or whatever you want to call it, and we're now into the aftermath territory, which is going to be filtering into the figures as we go on week. So sold subjects up 5.3, listings only up 2.4, more intentions to transact than 2024, a stronger market than 2024. But we will also do well to remember 2024 started pretty weakly, and also 2025 will have seen transactions rammed into the first quarter of the year because of the stamp duty changes. So we do have to bear all that in mind. But that 5.3 doesn't look like it's going away over the course of the rest of this year. I think we'll probably end the year 4 to 5% above where we were in 2024 on sold subject to contracts. And we'll probably see nearly an extra 100,000 transactions on the back of all of that as well, which is largely what people like Zoopla are expecting as well. They're pretty good on transaction volumes and numbers. Now, we went into October. So as of the 1st of October, there were 751,797 homes on the market, right? That's not the peak. The peak was 763,000 at the beginning of August. September normally is a rise. It was a rise on the 1st of September's number of about 15,000, not a ridiculous number. Let's see how many listings we keep getting versus how many sold subjects and completed sales and withdrawals that we keep seeing. It feels like we're going to put a few more on in October so far, but we're not even halfway through yet, so it's far too early to call it. Now that 750,000 odd number, that was 660,000 before the pandemic. So we're still seeing 90,000 more, or about 15% more on the market, right? In a seller's market, you tend to see below 600,000. Depends what's caused the seller's market, but you tend to see below 600,000 pieces of stock on the market. So we're miles and miles away from a seller's market, a good 20-25% away. 12 months ago, end of September 24, 723,000 were on the market. So only about 28,000 more than that. So not a huge, it's kind of played out over the year and is coming back more towards the mean, although there's still plenty of stock out there. As apart from anything else, landlords continue to dispose. I've seen numbers saying that 30% of stock in London on Rightmove, for example, is ex-rental stock. So that's a huge percentage compared to the percentage of stock that is in the private rental sector in London. But of course, it depends who's buying it. If owner-occupiers are buying it, it's coming out the rental market. If a corporate is buying it, it's staying in the rental market. But what we know is that's not creating new units, ultimately. So Chris always gets the sold subject contract per square foot, which I'm always keen as using as a good metric, right? £336.54 a foot in the first few days of October. Now, that's the first few days, so don't read too much into that. But it's lower again than August's number. We haven't had September's number proper yet. I'm hoping we'll get that next week from Chris at the end of this week, but not a lot higher. The August number was 338.78. And that was only 1.4% higher than August the year before and 14.25% higher than August 2020. So we've seen a real adjustment here to pricing. But as I say, don't judge too much by August's number as well, because August 2020 was ever such a funny month apart from anything else, right? August number was 2.2% down on June's. If we see a drop again, we're seeing we'll be close to sort of 3% off the top of the year. This is all going to play out in the land reg in about quarter 1, 2026. So expect to see some relatively sluggish looking figures around then. This is much more like what actually Halifax and Nationwide tend to look like in real time, because you've got them at between sort of 1.5% and 2% at the moment in their more real-time figures, which are not taking into account every transaction that happens in the UK. So there's a trade-off between accuracy and timing. And I do like to be as accurate as possible, of course, but I do appreciate We all need data to work off in the now. That's half the point of me doing all of this and you listening to it, I would imagine, right? So that October number is 3 days of sales. So let's just bear that in mind before we worry about prices going down too much. Fall through stayed slightly below the long-term average of 24.2, slightly above the average, they printed 24.6. It's really not very volatile around all that now. To say that 1 in 4 falls through is pretty accurate. It's not like it was in 2022, just after this mini budget meltdown 3 years ago, 40% of transactions were falling through. A lot of people didn't necessarily realise if the transaction fell through, they wouldn't keep their cheaper mortgage, which was suddenly looking in danger. And of course, some transactions fell apart because the lenders wouldn't necessarily have honoured the mortgage offers that they'd made. But there isn't a huge chronicle of all of that. I don't know how that actually played out in the end. I know how it played out in my group of businesses. And some lenders were not ethical about what they did, and some lenders were highly ethical about what they did. And I'll always remember that, quite frankly. So where are we? Well, net sales wise, 19,400, pretty good. 4.5% up on last year so far, 10% up on the pre-pandemic market, only 6,000 behind the net sales at this point in 2022. So when that meltdown has really kicked in, you're going to see us kick well forward in 2025 of the number of net sales. So that's gross sales minus fall throughs, the actual number of sales that go through, that are going to go through to completion. They're still sale agreed until they complete, of course, so it's not a guarantee, but it's the best number we can use really for actual transactions that takes out the noise of any fall throughs that occur with, stamp duty cliffs and goodness knows what else that sometimes happen. Now, Chris also did a bit of bonus content this week around London versus the rest of the UK. So in August and September, the sales agreed to listings ratio in London was 40.8%. In the rest of the UK, it was 75.4%. So it gives you some real context as to just how slow and difficult the London market has been. Now, it's always lower. There's always lots of stuff on the market. I think there's more unrealistic vendors in London than there is anywhere else in the country, to be honest with you. But still, that is a truly big gulf, ultimately. Now, he's included August in this analysis. I don't blame him because it's the recent months. It doesn't necessarily help. I'd love to see this on an ongoing basis, Chris. If you're taking any tips from me, I'd love it if you would keep this one in. Let's see what happens when October's in the books as well. I always give Chris this weekly shout out because he's much more prolific than just this epic tome that he releases every week on the UK property market. Great stats. His YouTube is at Christopher Watkin. He publishes his article on the Property Industry Eye website where you can give it a like, a comment, a share and all the rest of it. Connect with him. If you're in the industry and you want to support in growing your business, to be a more effective communicator, to be more in touch with your local market, to look more like a local market authority, that's Chris's core business. So make sure you give him a shout, and he does some fantastic work. So thanks for all you do, Mr. Watkin. I appreciate you. Okay, now it's time to be so macro. Construction PMIs were out this week, as was the KPMG REC jobs report as well, which I'm going to slide in here as well. Halifax released their price index, and the RICS residential market report was out. And then, of course, we have gilts and swaps to consider as well. So construction PMIs, output falling, but falling at the slowest pace for 3 months. Well, we nearly got a positive headline there, which is impressive considering the print was only 46.2. However, last month it was 45.5, and before that we were sub 45. So fair assessment. 46.2 breaks back to 46.8 for resi building, 46.4 for commercial work, and 42.9 for civils. That's 9 months in a row below 50 now, which also coincides with 9 months in a row of lower employment numbers in construction. What does the expert commentary say? Well, the downturn in orders was the least bad so far in 2025. Talk about thankful for small mercies. What about business activity expectations for the next 12 months? Well, worst it's been for 3 years. Bearish or what? I guess the firms can feel they haven't yet seen the bottom of this little mini cycle, or whatever you want to call it, construction recession. Some would say 9 months in a row of shrinking PMIs, and they're waiting for this bottom before they get more optimistic. But it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? And the actual national figures around construction don't play out quite as badly as what's been said there. So the GDP figures would disagree with that, but I'm pretty sure we're going to enter an effective construction recession when Q3's GDP figures are out. It would be a big surprise if we didn't, because the PMIs are not that inaccurate apart from anything else. Where are the positive areas of growth? energy security and infrastructure. But the looming budget, of course, has once again been mentioned as preventing CapEx commitments from being made in September in construction. And this 9-month period of job shedding is the longest consistent period of job shedding since the pandemic. And that's the closing sentence. How about the jobs report? I'm guessing expectations will be quite low here. Once again, positivity amidst the misery. Permanent placements declined yet again, but at the slowest rate for a year. Has the job market nearly absorbed 70 or 80% of the employer's national insurance shock? You know, the Bank of England's thoughts when I spoke to the rep about this was it would take about 2 years for that to filter through. So we've only had 6 months, but of course you would expect that shock to be concentrated in the first 6 months. 70 to 80% absorbed feels high though, doesn't it, based on that. But maybe it's plausible. You know, starting salaries are close to stagnant. You know, the uplift has gone to the government this year. It's as simple as that. In national insurance, extra employers' national insurance contributions. Demand for staff is falling. Candidate supply is rising, and you don't need an economics degree or two to be able to tell what that means. KPMG Chief Exec John Holt reported that CEOs are remarkably upbeat about future growth prospects, but they're focusing on AI, cyber risk, and upskilling existing talent. I heard an interesting theory actually on a podcast, The Rest is Money, with Robert Peston, and a very well-spoken, very authoritative AI expert on, talking about AI and the bubble and whether it was really a bubble and all this sort of stuff. It's quite an interesting episode if you want to listen to it. And he made an interesting point. There was some overhiring that went on during the pandemic. Now, this is a more general point, UK, but worldwide, certainly in America as well. People overhired, and therefore, instead of AI is currently more of a convenient excuse than it is a real reason for job shedding. But he does think, like many, that the job shedding will come, but at the moment, it's more about holding on to what you've got, and ultimately, the best that you can get out of AI, it comes from the more senior people. If AI can do the grunt level tasks, you still need the overseers, and you still need the experienced overseers to oversee those projects. And companies like PwC and KPMG and all the rest of them are not stupid. They're not just going to stop hiring graduates. But the point that he made in this podcast, which is also one that I wasn't aware of, was that yes, graduate hiring has slowed significantly. But for people without degrees, without college educations in the States, it's worse. It's not better. So this idea of a sort of white collar massacre of jobs or whatever is certainly not playing out at the moment. It's just a bit of a convenient tapestry, when really what the finance officers are doing is trying to make sure they keep a lid on costs. And the first part of keeping this lid on costs is by not hiring. And then the shareholders get happy, share prices go up, and everybody's pleased in a time of margins being in a bit more danger, depending on what industry you're in. So, Chief Executive of the REC has suggested that pay rise trends have stopped and pointed out there shouldn't be any concern to the Bank of England MPC members anymore when it comes to setting rates. That's Neil Carberry, and he suggested a pro-business, pro-growth budget would have significant positive impacts. I hope he's not holding his breath, and I'm sure his tongue was firmly in his cheek when he said that. Halifax House Price Index next, and up it wasn't. Indeed, the world fell apart, according to some headlines, and Charlie Lamdin was shouting from the rooftops. The index was down 0.3% month on month. The annual growth rate is down to 1.3%. What did the head of mortgages, Amanda Bryden, have to say? Well, she talked about the sideways market. Apparently, since January, we're only up 0.3%, according to Halifax. First-time buyer figures show an average house price of $236,811. Now, that first-time buyer price is up 1.7%, according to Halifax. And there hasn't been time yet for these relaxed stress tests around first-time buyers to really kick in. So I don't think that's too reflective of that. I think it's more reflective of the fact that cheaper houses are still eminently transactable. More expensive is harder, and there's more reasons to hold off on more expensive house purchases because you're worrying about removal of CGT relief, you're worrying about extra stamp duty punishing you for having a house over 500 grand, which would create the world's greatest cliff at 499,999, wouldn't it? Although I'm sure that would be increased every year with inflation or whatever. And then Amanda Bryden also wheeled out the usual party line about improving affordability. And look, it's slow, but it is true. If houses aren't moving upwards very much in price and wages are, ultimately, of course, it depends on the other costs of living and inflation and all the rest of it. But if you're getting a real terms pay rise, which everybody still has been over the past 24 months or longer, then ultimately you are still looking at housing that's becoming more affordable, not less affordable. Halifax has got the northeast up 4.8 and the northwest up 3.9. The southwest in comparison is down 0.2. Scotland up 4.5. Northern Ireland still winning, though, depending on which side of the fence you might be on, at 6.5% up year on year. London plus 0.6. The southeast plus 0.2, so just in the black. How about the RICS residential report then anyway? Well, the print of -15 on the balance was the best for a few months. As the headline, RICS prefers subdued momentum as the correct description of the current UK housing market. Buy demand and sales agreed are in negative territory. They're going backwards, and they have been for 3 months, and they expect this to continue in 2026. This time round, the South East and East Anglia are the softest areas on balance according to RICS. The new listings balance was -15% as well, the second month of contraction on that front in a row. We've seen that pattern play out in real time thanks to Chris Watkins' figures. For a little more than a couple of months, we've seen the 2025 listings coming back towards the 2024 listings numbers, as we know. RICS believe that house prices are creeping lower at the aggregate level. Now, I don't see any evidence for this, but if you were heavily biased towards the south of the country, you could see how this would be a reasonable claim. The 12-month sales expectation figures printed a negative number, -9%, according to the survey, for the first time since August 2023. And that seems pretty bearish, although perhaps that's saying, look, sales volumes have been surprisingly strong, and we don't really see a case for sales volumes to get stronger over the next 12 months. And that could make some sense, to be fair. But on pricing, +12% think prices will be up in 12 months' time. So remember how the RICS market works ultimately. If you're at +12, you've got maybe 56 that think they'll go up out of every 100 surveyors and 44 that think they won't go up. That might be sideways or downwards, which prints +12. So 56, 44, it's not incredible. It's 3 Brexits in many ways, 3 referendums, but it's hardly massively convincing as a vote of confidence. What about lettings though? Well, tenant demand changes, -1% according to the surveyors, compared to landlord instructions at -38%. As in spite of renters' rights booming, the bill looming over us, or the act looming over us, I should say, the print gets worse and worse, and that's the most negative since May 2020, which probably you have to write off as an anomalous month anyway. +23% see higher rents in the next 3 months, and 3% is the best guess at rental growth over the next 12 months, according to the RICS. Okay, I'm going to get straight into the dive. The Bank of England Financial Policy Committee had a meeting, and there's a report to talk about that also segues nicely into a really interesting article I was sent in the week by the author, which I want to get into. Some answers from Rachel Reeves without causing any more trouble. By trouble, I define that as stunting growth with policies that punish the private sector and therefore don't achieve what they should, because they then hurt future tax take by stunting that growth. Right, so it's a vicious circle kind of situation. That's exactly what the policies in the 2024 budget have done. And this 25 billion that was going to be raised by Employers' National Insurance, it's nothing like that that's ended up being raised. So I spend the vast majority of the time I spend covering the Bank of England on the monthly money and credit report that comes out, because of how important it is. Talks about the money supply, talks about mortgages, but it's one of the better early warning systems we would have if anything was to be going wrong that we didn't really see or know about. And then, of course, the rate setting monetary policy committee meetings. There are 8 a year of those. This week was the other committee, the financial policy one. What's their remit? Well, ensure financial stability across the UK. Now, there was a brief they were given after the horse had bolted in 2008, as you'd imagine, but then that's the public sector for you. The first section's a pretty standard practice these days. Elevated geopolitical risks, fragmentation of trade. I'd probably go a step further and say deglobalisation. I don't know why we're avoiding this phrase. I think perhaps it just worries people too much. We trade with other countries. They're struggling as we're struggling. Deglobalisation will also be inflationary. I would argue it already has been, and it will continue to be so unless there's a major strategic shift. And I don't just mean like Donald Trump's presidency comes to an end or whatever, because China is still going to be doing what China have been doing, for example. If they've been holding off while Trump's been the president, I guess we'll find out in 2029, won't we? Then the bit that has many people scratching their heads and shouting, fire in the hold. Risk premia are tighter, not looser. And that is unusual, right? Asset prices have been soaring. The AI bubble is regularly talked about, every day pretty much in the media. And the bank recognises the risks that if the expectations of the impact of AI become less optimistic. Now, surely they mean when, because we've been seeing 100% revenue growth and things like that in this area. That is not a sustainable situation that will go on. It will start to click back downwards. And then it's by how much they come downwards, because it isn't necessarily a bubble that pops. Liz Truss sort of squeezed the air out of the UK housing market without meaning to in 2022 and 2023 and early parts of 2024. And you could argue it's still having an impact now. Although in fairness, I think the yields have found their comfortable home without 2022 really being any particular influence on it anymore. But we did have a nearby, a very unaffordable situation when it comes to house prices, and we did need some kind of end to that. So I've often referred to that as sort of maybe an accidental piece of assistance to the market, not that that's what she meant to do in any way, shape or form. But the bank then talks about defaults in the US automotive sector. These are linked to credit provided to low-income families in the southwest US. And the FPC is effectively saying, don't lend money to people who can't afford it. You might remember that as a lesson from 2008, if we needed to learn it, although some people are not keen on the politics of that and the equality side of that. Now, the FPC then points to rising bond yields worldwide, driven partially by expectations of yet more debt issuance. Some is also politically based, for example, France. They also highlight questions over US Federal Reserve independence. Similar concerns to those I've highlighted over recent weeks and months that are probably legitimate concerns, I would suggest. But the domestic market is gauged as resilient but facing continuing pressures from the cost of living and higher borrowing costs, which is fair. The FPC concludes by saying it's doing its job in that if the UK banking system wouldn't blow up if economic and financial conditions got substantially worse than they're expected to. What didn't make it into the summary? Well, the bank's discussion paper, Enhancing the Resilience of the Gilt Repo Market. Whilst this perhaps doesn't sound as much of a page turner as Jilly Cooper's Riders, RIP, Jilly, this is a welcome discussion area given the importance of the gilt repo market to the system. In the repo market, a bank borrows against gilts as security from another bank who's got cash, when the first bank wants the cash for a short-term basis. It might be overnight, it might be a week, it might be weeks or months sometimes, but that's what the repo market's there for. A lot of this focuses around market makers, margins of safety when the doo-doo hits the fan, and also has the notion of minimum haircuts included. Bedtime reading if ever I saw it. But how about the solution to the current black hole, as those of us who remember Rachel Reeves' empty promises after the 2024 budget now call it, in an effort to stay as cheery as possible with the next chapter of more tax for landlords? Is there a business there somewhere? Probably not. And that's all looming now, of course. So I imagine Rachel is currently thinking, thank goodness I only said one budget a year. I shared a video of her on socials this week, looking deeply uncomfortable, recording some sound bites to the camera. I also had a disturbing conversation with a business partner whose CEO had met her, and after that conversation had absolutely no confidence whatsoever in her economic ability. So rather than this being an internet meme takedown or a misogynistic comment, that one I take far more seriously. Hopefully she has in the past 12 months got more savvy as to which suggestions from the Treasury to take forward, rather than another clumsy initiative, which then has to row back on anyway, like the winter fuel payment saga. Now, the article I'm commenting in is linked in the full version of the supplement. You can find that on my LinkedIn. I have a newsletter. You can subscribe to that newsletter. I also post it on LinkedIn once a week, and I share that LinkedIn post onto Facebook. So you can find the long URL for this article if you want to in the middle of that article. It gets into the idea I've raised a number of times here, stopping the hemorrhage and the horrific waste of taxpayer money that is achieved by selling gilts that are held by the Bank of England, alongside another solution which I've also discussed in passing, as it's been raised by various political figures, including Nigel Farage and Gordon Brown. Unusual and unlikely bedfellows, let's face it. but others have also raised this solution. So where's the context? Well, this time around, we're expecting a shortfall of about 30 billion quid, plus or minus a bit, plus or minus 10 billion, plus 10 billion between friends, when the OBR publishes their forecast on the same day as the budget, November the 26th. There are some huge riders to that, right, based on productivity estimates, growth, and the likes, and we won't know those until budget day. The influence the OBR wield is almost unimaginable. Just one more thing to thank Gideon George Osborne for, the man who learned economics on the job, when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a weapons-grade enemy of the private landlord. In terms of debt borrowing, in spite of many negative headlines, until last month, we were actually doing okay for a change on forecast. That absolutely fell apart in August figures, which were released on the 19th of September, showing that we've borrowed 11.4 billion more than the March forecast. This was due to, mostly according to the OBR, revisions based on increasing by local authorities so far this year. Also, August VAT and other tax receipts were lower than expected, 3.2 billion lower, no small beer. Again, this doesn't really cover it, does it, on this forecasting? But the solutions to said black hole exist within the central banking system, is the argument. Firstly, interest on commercial bank reserves. Simply put, central bank reserves are mandatory up to a point, right? There are regulatory requirements for the amount of capital you have to post, regulatory requirements that were tightened post-2008, for example, and regulatory requirements that are much more conservative than they are in the United States, which arguably is why you see banks in the US going bust on a more regular basis. But they have a very fractionalized system, 4,000 plus banks in the US. They're much bigger single entities in the United Kingdom market, much more regional in the US. And if you remember back to early 2024's banking pops that happened, there was one that specialized in crypto that was called Signature. These banks weren't outliers in terms of where they were on their risk curves. And they took big risks, and ultimately it sent them broke. And that's how the system's supposed to work to an extent, although we get much, much more nervous about the idea of a bank going bust in the UK. So the argument is the commercial banks haven't minded this anywhere near as much as December 2021, when the interest rate started to go on the rise, right? At one point, they were getting 5.25% on £800 billion plus of QE-related reserves. Yes, the bank had printed the money. That's what we say in common parlance. What we really mean is they were electronically created. And these reserves were the mirror image of the bank's QE and asset purchases, which were basically gilts. So if only the supplement had the budget of The Big Short, I would be cutting to Margot Robbie at this point. But sadly, we've got to press on with me. The bank bought, say, 100 million of gilts from a pension fund. The pension fund holds an account at a commercial bank. The bank credits the commercial bank's account with 100 million that's just been created. That's the new money. Then it receives 100 million in gilts in exchange for that it's just created. Yeah. And then if the vendor, say they wanted to then buy some more gilts to replace those gilts, it would either buy those gilts from the secondary market or it would buy them in new issues from the debt management office when that comes out. So gilt auctions are held regularly. The 100 million is now held at the bank's reserve account on behalf of that commercial bank electronically, and the 100 million cash payment is now in the pension fund's account with that commercial bank. Clear? Well, I hope so. But if it sounds like a bit of a work or a move or a scheme, well, that's because it is, right? Pre-2008, commercial bank reserves were 20 billion quid or so. By 2022, they were 900 billion quid. Yep. So that was costing less than £1 billion a year. Still no small beer, right? In interest when bank rates were 0.1%. But at 5.25, it was costing north of 45 billion a year. And that one really sneaks up on a government, as you might imagine. So how do you get that down? Well, think about three basic ways. Number one, you get the base rate down. But the Bank of England is independent and it doesn't worry about that 45 billion because that's not its job. And yes, I'm serious there. It worries about setting the correct rate of interest for the wider economy. And when you put it like that, that does sound reasonable. That's part of its point, right? Number two, you engage in quantitative tightening, but how you do it is an issue, particularly in terms of time horizons. And these first two are to an extent related. Now, I'm going to pause there before I get on to the third one. If you tighten, then to use the money printing analogy, reverse, you're burning money. What you're really doing is retiring these gilts and not replacing them with new gilts to keep the same amount of extra money in the system. If you sell them when rates are high and you bought them when rates were low or ultra low, guess what? You've lost money. However, you start paying that interest out on them as well. So that's handy. Or there's a trade-off there ultimately. Lose 10 billion today or lose X billion over Y years. That is the formula for consideration. Back to number 3 then. You lower the rate at which the commercial banks get compensated for holding these reserves. This has a number of effects. Firstly, the banks are more motivated to use this money, making new loans to support economic growth, hopefully, because having it sitting there doing nothing is no longer anywhere near as lucrative within the regulatory frameworks, of course. Then the banks also seek to recover this revenue contribution that their shareholders are ultimately enjoying very much via other methods, increasing margins on lending, increasing margins by putting rates up, increasing margins on saving by putting savings rates down. That could easily be one of those areas, right? And that would hurt the vast majority of the population just a little bit, some of us more than others. So as always, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The commercial banks don't get as well rewarded for doing nothing as they do at the moment. And really, it's a bit like universal basic income, really, but for the banks, really. They weren't really rewarded at all for this between 2009 and 2021 if we concentrate solely on the base rate. And of course, the QE side of things was ramping up at the time. We started with a mere couple of 100 billion, which ramped up to nearly $1 trillion at its height. And we're sitting at about 600-ish today, I believe. Now, the second argument that John, the author of the article, makes is one that he already knows I'm absolutely on the same page as, right? We share that with a smorgasbord of people from all sides of the political spectrum. Stop the quantitative tightening process, which may well save around 10 billion a year just by stopping it. This is where we actively sell gilts into the secondary market at a massive loss compared to when we bought them, right? That's because when we bought them, they yielded between nothing and perhaps up to 2%. So they were priced at or very close to face value. And when we're selling them, or have already sold them, because this all started happening in 2022, after they got rid of Liz Truss, that was supposed to happen before, we're selling them at lower values because yields are higher. There's very little reasoning outside of a heavy economics discussion as to why to be a net seller of gilts rather than just letting the gilts expire at face value. All it does is get the bank balance sheet down faster than you otherwise would if you let them expire. The interest that you pay to yourself, effectively as a nation, is ultimately returned to the Treasury anyway. So I'm talking about the interest on the gilts that the bank owns rather than the commercial bank reserves, which is the way in which the extra money, the quantitative easing money, was distributed. I appreciate it can be a bit confusing, but just try to stay with me, right? But I've advocated in the past for not only not selling these gilts into the secondary market, but actually buying gilts when there are arbitrages or anomalies in the market. For example, of late, the 30-year gilt yields have been extremely generous. Why not buy some as the Bank of England? Why not allow some of the retired gilt money? So that would continue the quantitative easing, and you'll see, but it would taper it down more slowly. Right? Now, you might say, well, hold on a second. Isn't that just going to keep the interest we're paying in the commercial bank reserves up? And it will be higher than it would otherwise be, but I'll get into exactly all of the impacts that would have, or that certainly I believe it would have if it was to take place. So, if the bank started buying 30-year gilts, guess what would happen? The price of them would go up, the yields would go down, right? So, it's not a no-brainer, no issues approach, as I've said. Market manipulation by the largest single player might concern markets. Personally, I think the market just get on with it and take advantage of it and start front running it. I'm not saying the bank employs Dr. Michael Burry in order to sit in front of a screen all day and trade as he sees fit. When the bank trades any gilts, there's a huge amount of telegraphing that goes on, upfront announcements and the likes. The bank never buys them from the debt management office. The debt management office only ever sells the gilts into the secondary market so that those auctions are transparent, genuine, and all the rest of it. That's why they only buy them from the secondary market, like pension funds in the example that I gave earlier on, right? So what would they buy in terms of duration? How would it all work? All of these questions are key, aren't they? But there's one very simple move the government could make. Give the bank the remit to deliver value to the UK taxpayer. If we bought some longs and some mediums strategically, what would also happen, right, which often isn't borne into mind in this argument, is what Japan has done for decades, effectively yield curve control. If by buying some bonds at a lower cost per year, we get our rate paid on our 97% of GDP of debt pile, there could be even bigger net savers on the deal, right? This could create a virtuous circle. Of course, it needs more detailed modelling, but it's possible, right? So, pause again for a second. There's no such requirement to provide good value to the taxpayer for the Bank of England. When I've spoken with BOE individuals on this very issue, they're almost cold and distant in their responses. Well, we don't need these gilts anymore, and so retiring the position makes sense. What? Even if it costs the UK more than £50 billion? That seems a bit crazy, doesn't it? Now, let's be objective. If you're lowering the reserves the commercial banks are keeping thanks to QT, you're lowering the interest bill as well, right? So rather than just capping or lowering the rate, it's not the only way to get this down. As I've said, you can also work on getting the base rate down, which would be helpful. But that's looking less and less likely at the moment as we see the inflation numbers on the horizon next week anyway. But there we go. So what about the moral argument within the confines of the financial sector, right? Two potential positions come to mind. Number one, the commercial bank started this whole thing. They were significantly responsible for the global financial crisis. And QE that then emerged was a big fallout part of that, right? Or two, you can't expect the private sector to mop up the actions of the public sector. This would set a dangerous precedent. But as you saw in the quote that I used to introduce today's video, ultimately there are many that believe this is public subsidy into private coffers, which also, if it was happening in any other industry, there'd be the biggest fuss in the world. But in the banking industry, just being, tens of billions just quietly being absorbed every year from the public purse, right? You can see merit in both of those sides. And, the irony is we don't even collect as much in tax from the banking sector when it comes to corporation tax. Bear in mind, we will collect PA, we will collect national insurance and the likes and all the rest of it, of course, personal tax, income tax from the employees. But there was a windfall tax on UK banks, which Jeremy Hunt trimmed in 2022 when he did his autumn statement. The amount of revenue raised from this windfall tax was nothing near the notional cost or the national cost of the 2008 crisis. It still exists, this bank surcharge, and it's a 3% extra rate on corporation tax. Right, it used to be 8% before Mr. Hunt trimmed it back. There was very little fuss or fanfare. I think you could say, if you were cynical, it's one of those classics that got through on the basis of fixing all the problems that Liz Truss had caused. And so very small rider at the bottom of the headlines, and the hatred for the banks publicly has definitely gone down significantly in the past 15 years, 17 years or so, right? Now, I was a fan of Jeremy Hunt's strict approach. It was hard not to compare him to what had come immediately before, of course, but he could have looked at the proposed solution of cutting the reserve rate or a cap, knowing what the direction of interest rates was looking like, because once Truss had been in, certainly the pathway for the base rate was going higher and higher, and Hunt would have known that these tens of billions were going to be funneled towards the banks. We could descend into significant conspiracy theories here. We could give him the benefit of the doubt and say he was distracted by the other things that were going on. But to take this point to lower the windfall tax on banks did seem like a very strange one, in my opinion. The government's never that proactive anyway, are they? That's just how the public sector works. He still had time in 2023 and 2024 to make this right. But Rachel Reeves could have addressed this in 2024, and she didn't. It really is low-hanging fruit, even though I accept it's a bit technical to understand. I appreciate there's also a concern here when it comes to compromising the independence of the central bank. But look, compared to moves that are carrying on across the pond at the Fed at the moment, this is a technical solution to a clear problem that has hemorrhaged tens of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. We should at least be having a go, shouldn't we? So, my idea of purchasing whilst gilts mature naturally will smooth cliff effects that exist in the yield curve, right? Often used as a counter to support active quantitative tightening, this yield curve effect, right? It would also mean QE would be harder to use if we needed it again. So we do have to bear that in mind. But when did we use it? Well, on the back of a 75-year event, the GFC, and on a 100-year event. And you could, if you wanted to, chuck the referendum into there, which is it's the only time we've left, isn't it? But a once in a 50-year event, maybe, would it be fair to say? Look, there's a margin of safety that we need, but I can't deny the point. My counter would be, why are you making moves that are needed in a 1 in 75-year event a 1 in 100-year event and maybe a 1 in 50-year event, if that's how often these things happen, is using 25 to even 50 years to let these moves unwind, is that not much more sensible? It would seem to be much more sensible to me, right? I just think we are bloody clueless, frankly, as a country, when it comes to controlling the yield curve and the cost of the national debt that we've racked up, because we haven't had to worry too much about the interest rate for the last 15 years, and there just aren't enough people banging this drum around central government. It's as simple as that to me. But anyway, how about some more points in support, right, if we need them? How about the fact that the current tactics are raising gilt yields rather than lowering them by pumping artificial supply into the markets? That's always going to get the price down and the yield up, because you're creating, aren't you? You're buying more than is wanted, and then you're having to replace them. So you're supplying more gilts into the secondary market. The bank have been criticised for this by me and others. They mark their own homework. They released a report saying, yeah, it's all fine. They were fine for a couple of years. Then they kind of just tweaked that over the last 12 months or so, very subtly. Their initial estimates were it added 10 to 15 basis points on the yields. That's 0.1 to 0.15%, right? Now, bear in mind, that range is still 2.8 to 4.2 billion per year extra that it's costing everyone. Right, that's just the government that it's costing. So it's costing, I suppose in many ways it's supporting the savers and it's costing the borrowers. But you need borrowing for economic growth. So I think I'd be quite clear on which one of those two is more important. And that 0.1 to 0.15 has been debunked pretty much since. The cost of the longer bonds was shown to be closer to 0.7%. So the bank was actually out with its marking of its own homework by a scale factor of 5. And that they have now admitted that they're wrong. They've gone to 0.15 to 0.25 and kind of ignored the rest. Consequences for anyone involved? Zero, apart from the cost to the public purse, of course, which, as I say, is in the billions. So did Jeremy Hunt understand this and ignore it? And what about Rachel Reeves, right? Only they can answer that, really. What I could tell you, they might answer that. Jeremy Hunt's pretty chatty on podcasts these days, and he's still a serving MP at the moment. So when he's not, I bet you'll have some really interesting stuff to say, to be honest. Rachel Reeves, I don't know what will happen of her when her time at number 11 Downing Street is over. I guess we will find out. Some people think we'll find out after this budget. So let's see. What I can tell you, there'll be a dozen or so people in the machine that absolutely do understand the nuances of this argument better than I do, right, from the governmental angle. They may not be the highest skilled orators. They may not be the most influential. They may be duty-bound never to talk about this stuff anyway. But that's a crying shame, because for me at least, the pros drastically outweigh the cons of doing this whole thing in a different way. How else can you attack the sell now QT side of the argument? Well, if you think rates are coming down, that's a reason not to sell, because the spread between the longer term loss and the loss now is lower, right? We bought them high. We're currently selling really low. If things come back a bit, we're selling less low, even if we sell them. My argument is we let them mature, but there we go. More evidence if it were needed. Well, it was 2022 before Truss was elected, as I've made the point before, when the bank confirmed they would follow this stupid policy path. And indeed, they did have to pause it when Liz and Kwasi were doing what they did. They didn't just pause it. They had to do what I've suggested, actually, and intervene to buy gilts, right? It restored confidence in the market. It controlled the yield curve. And on that trade, do you know what happened? The bank made money for the Treasury, £3.8 billion. Now, is that sort of money we want the bank to make? Because it probably made that from pension funds who were being forced into selling stuff. But ultimately, those pension funds, for using things like leveraged liability-driven investment, which is the phrase we all learned in 2022, LLDI and LDI, right? They're accountable for those decisions. They did not have to take leverage against the gilt positions that they held. If they hadn't borrowed against those gilt positions, they could have just achieved those normal returns. They were borrowing to squeeze out tiny, tiny extra margins. And their pension fund, the members of the pension fund, ultimately the ones who carried the can for that. Having said that, all those little problems got absolutely wiped out by suddenly getting massive returns on new gilts that gave pensions a massive ability to take less risk and get much better returns and be much less underwater. You used to hear about underwater pension schemes all the time, didn't you? You might have noticed you hardly ever hear about them these days. Now, it's a slightly different issue if there's things like defined contribution involved, final salary schemes and stuff like that. they are still exceedingly problematic and frankly unsustainable where they still exist in the public sector. Another problem, another rant, another soapbox for another day there, folks, right? But the middle ground, which is more John Newton's argument, who sent me the article, what do we aim for? Well, what about minimising the expected lifetime cost to the taxpayer of QT, subject to not compromising market functioning and monetary goals? Yeah, get rid of shorter dated bonds when possible, or just don't sell them. Sell only when the net present value of the trade is positive for the taxpayer. Publish a framework, carry versus crystallisation, so it can be taken into account by the OBR, for example. Lose £1 today only when it saves more than £1, adjusted for inflation, tomorrow. Right? You can probably tell I'm a bit more radical on this front than the middle ground is. Right, but who's to blame? Well, ultimately, the government. The bank is left doing bank things, lost in the theory of economics. The government gives them their briefs, and they need to get their heads around this and right the wrongs from 2022 onwards here, and in doing so, find a right few billion quid, as this article argues, right? Common sense, not very common, as you know. So, rather than just sticking with QT, back to the point around the commercial banking reserves. Farage sees this and just claims it's simple, a Trump-style solution. No interest for commercial banks. Right? No interest for commercial banks on the reserves held at the Bank of England. Now, today's base rate of 4%, that immediately saves £26 billion in this year. And with the rates, looking at the forward rates, look at about 3.5% to 3.6% and a little bit more onwards as we go onwards. It certainly saves at least 20 billion quid a year if you were to just do what Farage said, just looking at it from the public purse perspective. Right now, before the election, when he was talking about this, it was 45 billion quid. So that number has come down by 15 to 20 billion already. But that was always going to happen and taken into account in forecasts, because the forecasts were the yield curve was going to come back, or the base rate, the overnights were coming back down. Now, my concern remains that the commercial banks seek to make this money back rather than taking it on the chin, because that's how business tends to work. And they do that by raising their margins significantly on lending and saving, which hurts everyone a little bit, as I've said. But so far, we've lost about £22 billion in the difference between the interest saved by selling the gilts and the losses that we've actually booked, right? 45 billion losses, 23 billion in coupon payments saved, net present value-wise, I believe that is. The likely cost to gilts that are being sold at the moment at rates that are too high. As I said, the bank quietly nudged things up to 0.15 to 0.25. Well, I think you'd put that in the high single figure billions cost per year and call it 7.5 billion on new debt issuance, right? So we're already talking there about black hole filled potentially at the midpoint estimate. So perhaps you can see why I'm so excited about this issue, rather than more tax that is going to stunt more growth in this country. Now, the ultimate conclusion, it's not the smartest way to unwind quantitative tightening, what's going on at the moment. Do it mechanically and it loses money. That's what we're doing at the moment. That's what we've done. We're still doing that at the moment. Do it intelligently and it could save money, right? So back to the other point anyway, for completeness, how about bank rate gets tiered rather than just scrapped, as Farage has suggested? Gordon Brown's one who's advocated for this a little bit. John Newton's article advocates for doing it a bit more strongly on the back of a recently published paper by the IBBR Institute of Public Policy Research. Now listen, Gordon's been in the headlines a bit at the moment because gold's above $4,100 per ounce as I'm recording this, and that cost us a good 40 billion quid when he sold the reserves at a horrifically low price. Anybody who looked at a 100+ year graph of the price of gold would have known that was a shocking time to sell gold reserves. And what's pushing gold up at the moment, irony of ironies, is central banks around the world massively increasing their gold reserves. Why? They haven't got the same faith in the US dollar that they had at the beginning of 2025. So, European Central Bank only pays the policy rate on tiers of reserves, and excess tiers earn 0%. Thank this as having a punishment for reserves that are too large. Although whose fault is that when it's QT? I've already had that moral argument with you and put that out there. Swiss National Bank does the same. Bank of Japan pays the policy rate on a small portion and then 0 or even a negative rate on the rest. If you're going to adopt a long-term position where unwinding takes far longer, as per my suggestion, then the Japanese system is probably the one to follow, simply because they've got 30+ years of recent experience of doing this and maintaining monetary stability. This isn't the same as advocating for 200% plus of GDP being held as debt, please know. Although do remember, even when you hear Japan mentioned in this context, 230%, 250% of GDP as debt, that is their gross debt position. It's not their net debt position, because they hold, aside from everything else, $1.3 trillion worth, I believe, of US government bonds. So their net debt position, drum roll, is actually better than the UK's net debt position, because we hold so little in terms of other assets to offset that 97%. We're at about 85%, I believe, and Japan is at about 75% net debt. And of course, net debt is much more important than gross debt. But Japan always gets all these headlines. They've done a pretty good job of controlling their yield curve for so long. And look, it's a different country, different attitude towards inflation. Population is already shrinking, it's not growing. Different attitude to migration. Lots and lots of things I could go into. I'll save for another day, right? Well, how about you just ramp back up the windfall tax on the banks to recover this money? Well, the issue is that was only raising a couple of billion quid extra when it was 8%. So it's nowhere near the 25 billion plus still going out the door on the back of the reserves of the commercial banks being paid that interest. So I think just leave that one alone, personally. I wouldn't have cut it if I was Jezza, but he did, and now it's done, it's done. So next step in actually doing something about this would be to brief the commercial banks you're thinking about moving to a tiered system, with 0% being paid over and above the reserves that are ultimately set by the regulators, governed by the Bank of England. Let's see about what they say they would do. And of course, you could argue commercial bank reserves don't need to be held at the Bank of England, right? But you're going to put them somewhere. So they're part of the function of the Bank of England, so they ultimately probably are, right? So back to John Newton, the author of the article who shared this with me in the first place, that started this entire rant. Where's he at on the solution side? He's got a long and illustrious history working in public policy, housing, PFI, and lots of other interesting areas. He says cap the interest rate at 2% rather than 0, as per the above. Less dramatic than the Japanese solution, but the Japanese economy has lived at very close to 0 interest rates and 0 inflation for over 30 years, although that has changed in the past couple of years, mind. John uses the numbers from this IPPR recent publication, which is called Fixing the Leak, which is certainly credible. What's the saving from this? 35 to 40 billion this Parliament, right? We're on the same page on pausing gilt sales saving, according to the IPPR, £10 billion plus per year, although my active buying solution is more radical. John feels we can tax windfall-wise or tier, but I think the political noise around this is better at the tiering, saving the taxpayer money, and pausing the sales argument than the tax the banks rhetoric, although to an extent this is how you want it to land politically, depending on which party you're from, of course. But a windfall-style tax would need to be so much more aggressive than the bank surcharge, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So John is also happy to an extent to compromise the Bank of England independence by making the bank and the Treasury jointly own the public implications of the asset purchasing facility and quantitative tightening. And I would agree with this, right? It's a risk worth taking and a special project on the back of an extreme response to 2 large and genuine crises, arguably 3 or 4, actually, as it goes. If you were to count the referendum and how much it shocked the markets, regardless of what you think about Brexit, and if you were also to count the energy price shock, which is related but different to COVID, you've got some really genuine, remember the government had to underwrite up to 60 billion quid's worth of utility bills. It didn't end up being that ugly, but that was the blank check that Liz Truss wrote. And that wasn't the thing that sent the markets wild. It was the tax cuts on top of it that sent the markets wild. The point is that the amount of bonds held by the bank goes down every year. I would call it net quantitative tightening, right? But there's a taper. There's some buying and some selling within my framework. The time horizon that's acceptable is decades, not years. It isn't permanent, but it plays the game as currently framed, certainly within the OBR's 5-year time frame, which is ultimately how we run the public finances these days. Now, John also advocates for stronger scrutiny from the Treasury Committee of the link between fiscal and monetary policy. Now, we might disagree here, but that's because in all the committees I've ever listened to, when the bank are in front of the MPs, I've only heard about 2 or 3 voices on the committee side that really give me any confidence at all that they understand what is being said and what the implications are. They often end up explaining quite simple things to people in the Treasury Committee meetings, which is beyond disappointing, apart from it was quite depressing to listen to be honest with you. His final point really is improve communications with the public so you can actually understand all of this. Now, I'd love to get a bit of feedback here because did I present it in a way in which it's understandable? It made some element of sense in any way, shape or form. I hope so. My personal belief is that this is very hard for non-nerd types who have studied economics for a long time, partly because there are parts in the system that do, frankly, sound like they're a bit of a Ponzi. And, well, people think that can't be right. It can't be right what he's saying, but it is, right? There should definitely be a set of Ray Dalio-style videos explaining this. We have to rely on Ray's How the Economic Machine Works, which is obviously more US-focused anyway, as the best example of making that knowledge remotely accessible to people. Why don't we do more of that? But ultimately, wherever you land between John's very sensible position and my more radical position, doing something would be demonstrably better than the status quo for a well-controlled and limited amount of risk, unlike, for example, the 2022 budget. By the way, what was the ultimate irony? Well, if Liz had understood any of this, this would have saved the vast majority of the $45 billion that she wanted to spend in unfunded tax cuts on an annual basis. What a sausage she was. One more piece of context that's important here. What are the annual profits of commercial banks in the UK? Well, once again, we're at about 40 billion. So if you take away the excesses here, do you just have an inherently unprofitable commercial banking sector? Well, there's an easy answer that fits into the rules of the game. Taper it down over 5 years. Why 5 years? Well, it enables the OBR to take it all into account by the end of the forecast period. Right? Back to the enforced behavioural change argument then. What would they do if you did remove this massive risk-free windfall they've been benefiting from over the past few years? After all, they didn't have this windfall between 2009 and 2021. Now, they weren't in a great position to moan during a lot of that period, of course, because they caused the situation that we found ourselves in. But they did have support of various initiatives, such as funding for lending, for example. Not exactly the equivalent of Help to Buy for householders, but it did move the needle. So I turned to today's oracle, GPT, to forecast what the change in behaviour might look like in chat's opinion. What did it think? A PR campaign on policy confusion would come out, with the government taking the blame for higher interest rates on mortgages and lower interest rates on savings. However, it suggested returns on equity would fall from 10 to 12% in banking to 6 to 8%. So basically a shareholder and FTSE haircut because a free lunch has been withdrawn. I think we could probably live with that, couldn't we? How much higher in terms of rates? How much lower in terms of savings? It suggested 0.05 to 0.15%. So very much not a big deal. And isn't that strange, right? Because if you follow back my arguments above, you'd save that anyway on the entire pile of the national debt if we were more intelligent about our quantitative tightening policies, right? More cost cutting, more branch closures, sure, but any excuse, right? Anyway, so the regulatory framework and the banking hub solution is protecting customers anyway. As we speak, yes, you'll lose some jobs a little bit faster, but it will not be major. Lobbying, don't get me wrong, I fully expect to be nearly assassinated for championing this idea if I was anywhere near Westminster. Luckily for Lloyds et al., that isn't happening anytime soon. So I went into full deep research mode here via GPT, and if you've never tried it, you really should. What did it pull out here? 42 billion in wealth transferred to UK banks in 2023 alone. Changing this with the 2% cap would cause recovery via changing lending and savings margins, as they have already been said. Can't they just lend more money out, the commercial banks? Well, not necessarily, but they might have to put some more effort in, let's face it, because they stop getting their free lunch. There may alternatively deploy liquidity into other assets. There's a theory that credit could get tighter for riskier assets, right? Meaning lower overall loan growth, which would not be good, which would need to be reacted to, or maybe incentivized around, a bit like funding for lending to an extent. GPT concludes that savers are highly likely to get a raw deal here. Well, they used to after 2009 to 2021, right? Now, this is difficult as I expand on the machine's dissertation. 101 searches, 16 sources read in 14 minutes as it goes. Because from a really easy economic perspective at the moment, we're saving too much as a country. Let me expand. Historically, we were saving about 5% of our disposable income, second only to the US, who were lagging about 3%. But more recently, we've come back into the 10% category, having been at 12% up at the beginning of this year, right? Saving is the alternative to consuming. If we're not consuming, businesses aren't growing, right? Tax revenues aren't where they would otherwise need to be. So, and politically, you just could never say this. Good. Don't incentivize the savers to save as much as they're currently saving. We need it spent. We need that income flowing through the economy. right? Banks might also introduce fees for banking. They're common in many countries rather than free bank accounts. Charges might just go up. This might also see more money go into riskier assets, as we saw post-2009, with mixed merits ultimately. But what about gilts themselves? Well, if idle funds only get 2%, as in John's solution, and gilts return 3.5 plus, then banks are much more likely to buy gilts themselves, of course. So this has been used extensively in the US with different carrot and stick style approaches over recent years. But we would like our banks to hold our gilts. Wouldn't that be a great vote of confidence in the sector, right? Now, if banks are then buying gilts because they're 3.5% rather than leaving it at the Bank of England, guess what? Price of gilts is going to come. Price of gilts is going to go up. Yields are going to come down. So everybody benefits once again, and that extra bit of margin doesn't seem so painful, right? So what's not to like there? Well, GPT suggests it might also revive the interbank market, which has had its problems. You'll remember the LIBOR scandals and things like that. But if banks seek better yields, they're going to work harder for the money, right? The appetite for better returns might leak into corporate bonds, right? And that might be more risky assets and create more of a downturn possibility in a negative spiral environment, in a recession, right? GPT also recognises margins will be squeezed as lenders at lending banks, and shareholders will get hurt. But there's a very solid argument that the banks were fine before 2008, and they were still fine between 2009 and 2021. So this anomalous situation can be reversed without too destructive an impact. Ultimately, for me, what it comes down to is we don't owe the banking sector anything. They still owe us for how we bailed them out in 2008. And that is as moral as my arguments ever get, realistically. But I genuinely think that the people would agree with me. I don't see how they couldn't. Lower share prices, lower share buybacks, lower profit distributions for what is essentially unearned money that arose from the reversal of a situation that was engineered simply because of unscrupulous behaviour from the commercial banks, right? There's a bit of a more nuanced argument, which is the retail banks would be hit hardest here, and they didn't cause the majority of the issues in 2008. But let's face it, those two sides are often very, very close together anyway, and have very similar people in charge and people benefiting from them as a rule. So the more you look, the more you realise just how harmful the cut in the surcharge from 8% to 3% was, because bank profit jumped massively as the base rate exploded. If anything, it should have gone the other way temporarily. But as I say, what's done is done. A 3-year hike or something like that would have been a better idea at that point in time. GPT's efforts are so substantial. At some point, I'm going to put them on the newsletter on LinkedIn so you can read them on their own merits, right? Seriously impressive stuff. But nothing in there makes me think that John's solution or some kind of version of it or my solution should not be being strongly considered by the Treasury, by the bank, by the government, by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, right? It's very clear to me, both qualitatively and quantitatively, that it would be superior to the status quo and a low-risk calculated solution, right? I'm pretty sure if I was anywhere near number 10, number 11 Downing Street, telling them what to say and what to do, it would be making this into a positive story for the press to get them, you know, what we're doing is this is going to get rates down, this is going to do this, is going to that. You're going to be able to make promises that you will be able to keep, because the market will ultimately follow the way that you structure this unwinding of quantitative easing, which you brought in the first place as a government to save the market's backside, right? So as I draw this week to a close, the next workshop has been prepared. And as we turn our eyes to 2026, that next property business workshop is online and available. We're going to start the year with a bang. We'll be discussing strategic planning and how to get the most out of the next 12 months with some of our own methods and takes on productivity and time management alongside systems and processes. The other half of the workshop is about the most common pain point in SME property businesses: accounts, bookkeeping, and group accounting. This is about measuring asset performance, not how to use zero, but how to make the most out of financial information. What should you be seeing monthly, and how should you interpret it properly and use it strategically to grow your business safely but quickly? As always, we have real-life case studies about our own experiences and close with our no-holds-barred Q&A. Anything individual to consider? Get yourselves a VIP ticket and join myself and Rod for dinner in a smaller setting with an opportunity to discuss any specific roadblocks or issues in your property business at the moment. Join us Thursday, the 22nd of January 2026, Central London, bit.ly/PBW and then a number 9, link in the show notes. But above all, please make sure to remember to keep calm, always listen to the supplement, of course, and carry on. There are opportunities abound this year and towards 2030 and beyond. The landscape has been set for a surefire bull run. It's slowish, it's going to take a while to get off the ground, and the amount of stock around at the moment is still keeping things suppressed at the moment. But as the market continues to improve slowly, it's a case of here we go, in my opinion. Thanks for listening.